Now, rebasing the consumer price index essentially means refreshing the framework used to gauge price levels, ensuring that data accurately represents the economy's current state. Now, the NBS noted that this shift played a key role in the observed drop in inflation, moving away from the older template that had pegged December's inflation as 34.80%. But we'll look at the real impact of all of this, because I believe that Nigerians are still, feeling the pinch in terms of food prices. I have research analyst Adeyemi Adeniran joining me now in this conversation. Many thanks for joining us on Business Insight and Plus TV Africa, Adeyemi.
Thank you for having me, Justin.
All right, I was just trying to break down CPI, but then you are a research analyst that you've been on this particular trend for a bit. Why is it necessary that we rebase the CPI at this particular time? Just before we get into the statistics and the figures released by the NBS yesterday, what's the international best practice, as it were, in terms of CPI and the rebasing and all of that?
Well, from what I understand, the national best practice means that the CPI, the metric for calculating CPI needs to be rebased maybe every 5 years. But in the case with Nigeria, we've seen is that we've not rebased the metric for calculating CPI since 2009, which is what the NBS is doing now, trying to see how they can allow this calculation to capture the current reality.
So invariably, what you have just said is that in about 16 years now, we may not have been getting the right statistics in terms of how we've been measuring inflation in the country over the years.
Well, there's always been that criticism from economists, from experts, that the metric for calculating CPI in Nigeria, it's incorrect. But although, there's this conflict now in terms of the final figure we are seeing, which is 24% or thereabouts. So I don't know if you've been following this economist, Steve Hank. So he comes up with misery index for about 170 countries every year. So you see, misery index is a function of the current inflation rates, the employment rate, and the benchmark borrowing costs for any economy. So it gives you the final figure, and it tells you basically the standard of living of the citizens in that country. So Steve Hank has always been very vocal that Nigeria's inflation rate is not what the NBS is saying it is. I think sometime about a couple of years ago, when we were still saying inflation is 22% or thereabouts, he was saying that we were at over 50% inflation. So so there's that also element of conflict between what some experts are saying and what the NBS is saying. But the most important thing here ultimately is the fact that the metric has been rebased, because when we talk about calculating inflation, it's very important for us to do it on the basis of the current realities.
All right, let's talk about the recent figures now released by the NBS yesterday, because it was actually a significant drop, dropping to about 24.48% as against the 34.8 that we had previously. But my question right now is that what has really changed? Because right now, to some people, they would want to just see it on the surface level and say really that the inflation has actually eased. But in real terms, if you ask me, specifically, let's talk about food prices now. Food inflation, is at 26.08%. Does it mean that we are doing better in terms of how our food prices are in the local markets?
No, absolutely not. I think that one of the things that the Statistician-General did not really communicate was the fact that, he told us the reason for rebasing the metric for calculation. But what the NBS didn't tell us was that this does not mean that the prices in the market are lower than they were last year or, in December, which is the last time the calculation was made apparently. So it's important for Nigerians to know that because it is actually a very big thing. If you look at the way inflation moves, inflation doesn't move like interest rates. If you look at the way inflation moves, 10% increase in inflation is a big deal. It is a very big number in terms of when you look at percentage, from basic point of view, and when we say inflation increased or reduced by 10%. So it is a big deal, and it's important for the statistics body to communicate that this doesn't necessarily mean that the prices are lower than they were last month. So, I've said this some time ago. When you look at, because this is a research that I've conducted myself, when you look at the inflation rate over a period of 3 years, let us go back to, I always want to go back to December 2022 because that was really the first time, according to MBS data, the first time in a long time that we were able to push back inflation. So you find that within a period of 36 months or thereabout, we've had it's been maybe only about 3 times that inflation did not increase over the course of 36 months. So you always find that every month there's maybe a minimal increase in inflation rate. So it also is very instructive now for us to say, okay, we are doing 24% on the basis of rebasing the calculation, but we can easily get to 34 again if the trend that we have seen in the past couple of years continues.
Okay, but let's try and understand further some of these figures, because what it's actually looking like is that these inflation drivers are beyond food now, and inflation drivers beyond food rather have become more prominent. What do I really mean? Because I'm trying to look at the data now. It shows that core inflation, now stands at 22.59%, reflecting the rising cost of non-food essentials. What does this really tell you, Adeyemi?
Well, one word, wokeism. Okay, of course, we are in an era where, we have our young people who, of course, for every generation, there's a different interest, there's a different, just basically the kind of human activities that, attract attention of the young people. So it tells you that the consumption patterns are changing, and of course, apparently, while food, transport may be the basic necessities of life, it also tells you that maybe our generation is also very much interested in how they look. I can see you are dressing very nice in your suits that cost maybe $2,000 or something like this. So
I wish you did.
Yeah, so it tells you that. Of course, the interest of our interest in the past 16 years or thereabout, there's been a shift, emphasis on other things other than food.
Okay, let us look at some of the gaps really now. I just pinpointed, so let me see if I can just highlight them. The gap between urban inflation is, the urban inflation stands at 26.09%, and rural inflation is at 22.1.5%. What does this really tell you in terms of housing and transportation costs? They are a bit disproportionate in terms of how it affects urban dwellers.
Yeah, of course. There hasn't been much difference there, if you ask me, if you look at NBS figures historically, because urban inflation is always going to be higher than rural inflation for the obvious reason. But when you look at transport and housing, of course, there's also going to be that element of disparity in the numbers. So I don't see this as something that is fundamentally different.
Okay.
If you look at NBS statistics 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, or however long you want to take it back.
Okay, fine. I know that this is us trying to be at par with international, best practices and the standards and all of that. But in the real terms, I really need to understand now. What do you really think all of this, the new figures, what does it really mean for Nigeria's economy? In as much as we know that food prices are still biting and we're still suffering the issue of food insecurity.
Well, one, it means that we are not out of the woods yet.
Okay.
Because over the past 2 years or thereabout, there's been this withering emphasis on the high cost of products. So inflation has gone down by 10%, but we also have to face that very real, the reality that this does not impact prices in any way. Yeah, but it could also have some sort of kind of positive tone on the economy,
in what sense?
Especially when you're talking about foreign investment. Because if you send a delegation, for instance, to go to Asia, to go to the Middle East, to canvass for foreign investment, there's always going to be discussions around the macroeconomic conditions. Okay? So, of course, 24% certainly looks better than 34%. So, yeah, when we're looking at foreign investment, there's also that element that we could have better conversations in terms of trying to persuade and draw foreign investment into the country. But more importantly, this also means more work for our economic managers because, like I said, we are 24% today, moving from 34%. But over the next 18 months, we can easily get back to 34% if our economic managers do not do what is necessary to attack inflation from its root.
Let me butt in there, since you've mentioned the economic managers, because it is interesting because you said there should be more work, but in terms of policy thrust, what adjustment should the economic managers be doing in terms of economic policies to affect Nigerians to tackle this issue of inflation, specifically that of food inflation?
Yeah, a few weeks ago, the CBN governor, and he has been saying this for a long time now, that the emphasis right now is to tackle inflation. But like we saw the presidency do in terms of addressing issue of taxation, setting up the tax panel that was led by Adeyemi, and we've seen the outcome of that with the tax reform bill. So I think there always has to be that level of action when you say you want to do something. So, yeah, we want to tackle inflation, but what is really the plan of action to tackle inflation? Because if I was in that position, I would be saying, what is the biggest cause of inflation in Nigeria? And most of our inflation is imported. I always do not want to reel out figures without backing it up with research. But you agree with me that a significant amount of the inflation that we are experiencing in Nigeria today is imported. Even most of the food we eat is imported. Most of the clothes. I go back to this your nice suit that you're wearing. It's imported. Yeah.
You don't know that for sure, Ididion.
Yeah, so it's very important for, of course, we go back to local production now to see how we can support local production and just push a little bit backward on importation. This really is the way to go. Otherwise, like I said before, it's very easy for us to go back to 54%.
Okay, as we begin to round off now, I just need to get your opinion on how best you think we can address this structural inflation in terms of housing, transportation, and of course energy?
Yeah, that's a good question, Justin. Very critical component of our economy. And, energy is something that it's a problem that has almost become, it has been a perennial problem with Nigeria's economy. I think I've been on here before, and we talked about the issues with our power sector, and it goes back to the point that I made earlier. We've seen the privatization of power in terms of distribution and generation, but that gap in transmission is something that needs to be addressed. We're having far too many grid collapses. So these are issues that we don't just need theoretical answers to, but the kind of action that we saw the presidency take, because it was really a laudable initiative, if you ask me, and this is really the way to get things done. You want to do something, you put up, a panel, a committee, give them their terms of reference, give them, a target, give them a timeline to deliver, on the basis of what needs to be done going forward. So we haven't really seen that level of action. Most of what we've seen have been mostly theoretical, and we need to see that in the energy sector as well. Otherwise, these issues will continue. Then on housing is actually quite a very difficult problem for the government to solve right now, particularly because much of the problems that, property developers face today are problems that are deep-seated in our economy. So you have maybe in advanced economies, for instance, where you have in some states what they call rent control. Okay. Can you implement rent control in Nigeria? You can't, because the developer will say, listen, I used to buy building rod for 120,000 3 years ago. Now I'm buying it for 1.2 million. So how are you going to implement rent control? So that's why I said it's one of the most difficult problems that the government faces today. But the point I will make is this. I saw about maybe a couple of years ago, Lagos state government come together with Afriland Properties to try to see how it can partner in the direction of a structure somewhere in Ikoyi, follow more towards. Okay, so if we can have that level of partnership between the government and private developers, then I think we'll be a step closer to solving that problem.
All right, thank you, Adeyemi. We really have to go because we are out of time. We have been speaking with research analyst Adeyemi, and we have been talking about rebased CPI and the impact on inflation and all of that. Many thanks, Adeyemi, for your time on the show.
Thank you for having me, Jackson.
All right, in my opinion, I would say that the rebasing just actually altered calculation as it is, but the main crises have not been erased. But I just hope that it will not be an excuse for policymakers to just downplay these figures and say that we are doing better. But then it is actually a call to action, for them to tackle in the immediacy all of these issues affecting Nigerians, and of course, so that we can actually have food in our stomachs and go to bed with both eyes closed. Many thanks to all of you who have sat back to watch the show for today. My name is Justin Akadonye. Many thanks for being there.